A little charity for the poor wife. Isabella Fairchild's voice rang through the candlelit dining hall of Whitmore Manor, like a bell struck to draw blood. Every head turned, every breath held. And then the sound of a single coin dropped onto Eleanor Ashford's china plate. The room waited for tears. They expected collapse. What they got was silence. Cold, deliberate, unbreakable silence. Eleanor picked up that coin, studied it, slipped it into her glove. And the man she married laughed. If this story makes your blood run hot, you are not alone. Stay with us, friend. Subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from tonight? England, 1818. Whitmore Manor had never looked more magnificent than it did that November evening. The chandeliers burned with 200 candles. The long mahogany table groaned beneath silver platters, roasted pheasant-spiced puddings, and crystal decanters of wine, the color of dark rubies. 40 guests filled the chairs, lords and ladies, members of Parliament, men who owned half the countryside from Yorkshire to Devonshire, women who wore their jewels like armor and their opinions like weapons. Eleanor Ashford Whitmore sat at the far end of that table, halfway between the fire and the door, in a cream gown that cost less than anyone in that room would have paid for a single glove. That was a choice, not a poverty. But no one in that room understood the difference. She had been Nathaniel Whitmore's wife for 3 years. In those 3 years, she had learned to read a room the way her father once taught her to read a ledger, quietly, thoroughly, without letting a single number catch her off guard. She watched the way Lady Covington leaned toward her husband whenever Nathaniel spoke, a gesture of admiration, so practiced it had become reflex. She noted how Mr. Alderton's eyes tracked the silver candlesticks rather than the conversation. She observed as she always did, and she said very little. Society had drawn its conclusions long ago. Eleanor Whitmore was the quiet one, the plain one, the fortunate one. Fortunate to have caught the eye of a man like Nathaniel, who was handsome and prosperous and respected by everyone who mattered. She married above her station, they said. Not cruelly always. Sometimes almost kindly, the way people say such things when they believe the subject cannot hear. Eleanor heard. She had always heard. She simply chose not to answer. Nathaniel sat at the head of the table, exactly where he believed he belonged. He was 35 and looked every year of it in the best possible way. Broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with a jaw that English portrait painters adored, and a smile that opened doors without his needing to knock. He laughed easily that night. He touched his guests on the arm. He told 3 stories Eleanor had heard before and made them sound new. She watched him, and she felt the familiar ache she had learned to live beside, the way you learn to live beside a window that lets in cold air. You stop expecting warmth, and you simply pull your shawl a little tighter. Isabella Fairchild arrived late, which was not an accident. Eleanor knew the moment the doors opened behind her. She did not need to turn around. She read it in the faces across the table, the small sharpening of attention, the way certain eyes flicked toward Nathaniel and then immediately away. She felt it in the quality of the silence which changed the way the air in a room changes when someone strikes a match. Isabella was 24, and the kind of beautiful that other women describe with the word striking, which means impossible to ignore even when you desperately want to. She wore deep blue silk sapphires at her throat, and the particular confidence of a woman who has never once entered a room and doubted her right to occupy it. She took the empty chair 2 seats from Nathaniel's right. The chair that had been empty all evening, Eleanor now understood for precisely this purpose. Nathaniel's smile when he looked at her was different from the smile he used for his guests. Softer. More unguarded. The smile of a man who has forgotten in this precise moment to be careful. Eleanor watched it happen, and she did not look away. Looking away had never been her method. Dinner progressed. Wine was poured. Conversation moved from politics to property to the upcoming season in London. Eleanor spoke when addressed, which was rarely. She answered Lord Pemberton's question about her family's estate with exactly 4 words, "It fares quite well," which satisfied him entirely because he had not been genuinely curious in the first place. Isabella spoke often. She was witty. She was charming. She held Nathaniel's attention without appearing to hold it the way an experienced rider controls a horse without looking at the reins. Eleanor recognized the skill. She was, after all, skilled herself, simply in different arenas. It was during the third course that it happened. Eleanor had reached for her wineglass when she heard the sound. A small, bright metallic ring against fine china. Like a bell. Like a verdict. She looked down. A single coin sat on her plate. 1 shilling. Nothing more. The table went quiet in sections like a fire going out from one end of a hearth to the other. First the guests nearest Isabella. Then those across. Then finally, even Lord Pemberton stopped mid-sentence about his hunting estate. Isabella's voice was perfectly modulated, loud enough for the entire table, soft enough to seem like private conversation. The skill of a woman who had practiced cruelty until it became elegant. A little charity for the poor wife. A pause. Then the smallest possible smile. We must all do our part. No one laughed. No one spoke. No one moved. Every eye in the room landed on Eleanor Ashford Whitmore. This was the moment Isabella had planned. The moment designed to confirm everything the room already half believed, that Eleanor was lesser. That she was grateful. That she was at best a minor figure in the story of her own marriage. Eleanor looked at the coin. She did not look at Isabella. She did not look at Nathaniel. She picked up the coin between 2 fingers, the way you pick up something requiring examination. She turned it once, studied the king's profile stamped into the silver. Then, without rushing, without a tremor in her hands, she opened her glove and placed the coin inside. She closed the glove. She lifted her wineglass. She drank. And Nathaniel laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. That was almost worse. It was a reflexive laugh, the laugh of a man who does not even pause to consider whether laughter is appropriate, because the woman at the other end of his table does not exist to him in the way that would require consideration. 2 or 3 of the guests joined in. Nervously, briefly. And then Eleanor set her glass down, placed her napkin beside her plate, pushed back her chair. She did not hurry. She rose with the measured steadiness of a woman who has decided something, and the decision is not anger, it is clarity. "If you will excuse me," Eleanor said. To no one in particular, to everyone in the room. Her voice was even and unhurried, and it carried because she had never needed to raise it to be heard. She walked the length of the dining hall without looking back. Her heels made no sound on the carpet runner. The doors opened before her, one of the footmen. God bless him, was quick enough to manage that, and then she was through them, and the candlelight was behind her, and the laughter was behind her, and 3 years of a marriage that had slowly, quietly, systematically diminished her was behind her. She did not run. She walked to the coat room, collected her own cloak. She knew where it was, because she had learned long ago not to depend on staff who answered to Nathaniel before they answered to her, and she went out through the side entrance into the cold November night. The carriage she had arranged that morning was waiting in the service lane. She had arranged it that morning. She had known. Not the specific form the humiliation would take, but she had known it was coming. She had seen it building for months in small gestures and small absences, the way a person who has studied weather long enough can smell a storm before the clouds arrive. She had simply been waiting to confirm the last thing she needed to confirm, that Nathaniel would not stop it. He had not stopped it. He had laughed. The carriage moved through the gate. Eleanor did not look back at Whitmore Manor. She had spent 3 years looking back, reconsidering, reinterpreting, offering the benefit of doubt, as though doubt were a currency she could afford to spend without limit. She was done now. She was not crying. She had expected to cry, had half braced for it on the carriage seat the way you brace for cold water, but the tears did not come. What came instead was something quieter and more durable. Something that felt after a long time of not feeling it like herself. The carriage carried her north toward Ashford. Arthur Mercer was 61 years old, had served the Ashford family for 37 of those years, and was the kind of man who could be awakened at midnight, offered no explanation, and still have the correct documents on the table before you finished asking for them. He met Eleanor in the front hall of the old family residence when the clock was striking 11, his coat hastily buttoned, but his expression entirely unsurprised. "I expected you last month," he said, taking her cloak. "I expected myself last month," Eleanor answered. "Make some tea." They sat in the library, a room that smelled of her father and her childhood, and every decision she had ever watched be made by people who trusted her enough to let her observe. The fire was already built. Arthur Mercer knew her habits. She set the coin on the table between them. He looked at it. "Tell me about the documents," Eleanor said. "All of it. Everything you found." Arthur Mercer folded his hands, and his voice was steady and quiet. The voice of a man delivering a diagnosis to a patient who has already in some part of herself already known. "He began 3 years ago," Mercer opened. "Approximately 4 months after your wedding." Eleanor nodded once. "He hired a solicitor in London, a Mr. Gideon Price, who has a certain reputation in certain circles for being willing to perform services that reputable firms decline. What Price did over the course of 2 years was draft a series of amendments to the original Ashford inheritance documents. Not forgeries precisely, or rather not clumsy forgeries. They were sophisticated alterations, designed to appear as clarifications of your grandfather's original bequest. And the purpose? The purpose was to establish that the Ashford estate, the land, the properties, the mineral rights, the trust transferred to your husband upon your marriage, under the authority of the older coverture laws which my father specifically circumvented when he arranged my grandfather's bequest," Eleanor said. "Yes." Arthur Mercer's voice carried the particular weight of a man who had spent years preparing to have this conversation. "Your father was unusually prescient on this matter. He did not trust the standard protections. He structured your inheritance under specific legal provisions that kept the estate in your name, regardless of marriage provisions that were unusual but entirely lawful. Nathaniel discovered this approximately 8 months after your wedding, when he attempted to refinance a portion of Whitmore's debt against the Ashford land, and was informed by his own bankers that the Ashford holdings were not available as security." Eleanor set down her teacup very carefully. "He tried to borrow against my estate without telling me. He tried and was refused. After that refusal, he engaged Price." She was quiet for a moment. The fire cracked. Outside, the wind had come up and was pressing against the old window panes in the way it always had. And Eleanor was briefly painfully aware of how much she had missed this room. How much of herself she had left here in this house when she went to Whitmore Manor as a bride, with every intention of building something worth having. How close did Price come to succeeding? "He completed the altered documents 8 months ago. They have not been filed. I believe Nathaniel was waiting for the right moment, specifically waiting until he had arranged the investors for his expansion plan, so that when the transfer of ownership was discovered, the financial arrangements would already be too advanced to unwind. He plans to announce those investment arrangements in the new year. And he believes I won't fight it." "He believes," Arthur Mercer said, with the careful diction of a man choosing words like a surgeon selects instruments, "that you do not know." Eleanor stood, walked to the window. Outside the grounds of Ashford stretched in darkness the old oak along the east fence that she had climbed as a girl, the stone wall her grandfather had built by hand in the years before the family's money came the frozen creek that ran along the south border. Her land, her inheritance. Her father's gift to her, and his declaration written in wills and writs and careful legal language that his daughter's future would belong to his daughter. "He questioned me about the estate," Eleanor said. "Not to Arthur Mercer exactly. To the window, to the dark. For the first year of our marriage I thought he was interested because he loved me, because he wanted to understand what I came from. He asked about the mineral surveys, the tenant arrangements, the London properties." She turned from the window. I answered him. Arthur Mercer said nothing. This was one of his considerable gifts. "I answered every question," Eleanor continued. "I was proud of this estate. I wanted to share it with him. I thought that was what a marriage was, sharing what you had come from, sharing what you cared about." A pause. "And all the time he was mapping it, taking inventory, learning what he needed to learn to take it from me." "Mrs. Whitmore." "Eleanor." Her voice was not sharp, but it was final. "I am Eleanor Ashford. In this house, in this library, I am Eleanor Ashford. We will dispense with the other name for tonight." Arthur Mercer inclined his head. "Eleanor, what do you want to do?" She returned to the table, picked up the coin again, looked at it for a long moment, and thought about the dining hall and the candlelight, and Isabella Fairchild's perfect voice, and Nathaniel's laugh, that unthinking, unguarded laugh that had revealed more than any document or legal alteration ever could. "I want to protect what is mine," Eleanor said, "and I want it done properly, not hastily. I will not give them any reason to claim I acted from emotion. No." Arthur Mercer allowed himself the smallest possible smile. "We will act from law. What do we need?" "The original inheritance documents, which I have. Your grandfather's trust records, which I also have. A qualified barrister who specializes in property law and women's legal rights. There are 2 in London I would recommend. And time." He looked at her steadily. "A month, perhaps 2, to build the case correctly." "I have time," Eleanor said. "He does not know I know. He will continue believing that I am sitting quietly at Whitmore Manor, waiting for him to return from whatever engagement keeps him elsewhere." She paused. "He will not check on me for days. He never does. And when he realizes you have left..." Eleanor placed the coin on the table between them. "Tell me, Arthur, what is Whitmore Manor's current mortgage situation?" Arthur Mercer's expression shifted with great subtlety. "Substantially over-leveraged. He borrowed heavily 18 months ago against his own family properties for an expansion that has underperformed. So without the Ashford estate to refinance against, he is in a rather difficult position." "How difficult?" "Ruinous if his investors withdraw." Eleanor nodded slowly. "And his investors will be watching. They will hear about tonight. Men who risk capital watch very carefully for signs of instability in the men they back. A public humiliation at a dinner party. A wife who leaves without explanation, rumors, questions." She looked at Arthur Mercer. "He will come to me, not from guilt, from necessity. And when he does, then he will discover," Eleanor said, "exactly what I've been carrying with me all along." She folded her hands on the table. Her eyes were steady and dark and entirely clear. The firelight moved across her face, and Arthur Mercer, who had known Eleanor Ashford since she was 8 years old, thought that he had never seen her look more completely like her father. "Start with the London barrister," she said. "The better of the 2. And Arthur, not a word to anyone in Whitmore's circle. Not his solicitor, not his banker, not his servants. Of course, we will let him believe what he has always believed." A pause. Long, deliberate. "That I have nothing." The next morning, Eleanor rose at 6 and walked the estate grounds in the first gray light, her breath clouding in the cold air, her boots leaving clean prints in the frost. She walked the east boundary first, then the south pastures, then up to the ridge where you could see the rooftops of the village below and beyond them, the church where her parents were married and where her father had been buried 4 years ago. She stood there for a long time. Her father had been a careful man, a quiet man. Not flashy in the way Nathaniel was flashy, not the kind of man who filled a room with his presence and made other men feel smaller by comparison. He had been the kind of man who spent 30 years building something solid, and then spent the last decade of his life making sure it would last, making sure it was protected, making sure his daughter would never be dependent on anyone else's goodwill for her survival. She had not understood when she was young why he was so particular about the legal structures of her inheritance. She had not understood why he consulted with 3 separate solicitors and a barrister who specialized in trust law before he was satisfied. She had not understood why he looked at her when the documents were finally signed, with an expression that she could only now at 27, standing on this frost-covered ridge, correctly identify as relief. He had understood something she had needed 3 years to learn: that the world would look at his daughter, educated, intelligent, competent, caring, and would nevertheless attempt to take from her. Not because she was weak, but because the world had decided in its arrangements and its assumptions that women like Eleanor existed for the benefit of men like Nathaniel. Her father had decided otherwise. He had made his decision in ink and law and careful, loving attention to detail. Now Eleanor would make hers. She came down from the ridge when the sun was fully up and found a letter waiting on the hall table delivered by a Whitmore stable boy who looked cold and uncertain and was clearly trying to determine whether he was bringing news to the lady of an estate or a runaway wife. Eleanor opened the letter without asking him any questions that might require uncomfortable answers. Nathaniel's handwriting was bold and impatient, the handwriting of a man who wrote quickly because he was always thinking of the next thing. Eleanor, your departure last evening caused comment. I trust you are well and will return by tomorrow afternoon, as the Alderton family has been invited for supper, and your absence would require explanation. We need not speak of the unpleasantness at dinner. These things happen in society and are best forgotten quickly. N. She read it twice. Then she set it in the fire. The stable boy, to his credit, said nothing. He was young and clearly clever enough to understand that his wisest course of action in this particular situation was to wait in the hall until someone told him what to do next. Tell your master, Eleanor said calmly, watching the letter curl and blacken, that Mrs. Whitmore is attending to family matters and will be in contact in due course. Yes, ma'am. And take this with you. She went to the small writing desk in the corner of the library, opened the locked drawer with the key she kept on a chain at her neck, and removed a folded document. Not the main inheritance papers, those she would not send anywhere yet. This was a property survey. The most recent one completed by her father's surveyor 2 years before his death, listing every holding of the Ashford estate in precise and thorough detail. She folded it once more and handed it to the boy. Give this to Mr. Mercer at his office in the village when you pass through. Tell him Mrs. Whitmore sends it with her regards. The boy left. Eleanor stood at the window and watched the gate until he was through it. Then she went to her father's old desk, sat down, and began to write. Not to Nathaniel. Not yet. To her own solicitor. To the barrister Arthur Mercer was recommending. To 2 women she knew in London, women who moved in the same social circles as Nathaniel's investors, and who owed Eleanor certain quiet debts of information and loyalty, because Eleanor, unlike most people, had always remembered to be useful rather than merely pleasant. She wrote carefully. She wrote precisely. She used the plain, clear language her father had always preferred, no flourishes, no sentiment, only facts arranged in their correct order. She was not angry. She had moved through anger in the carriage last night and come out the other side of it into something more useful. She was clear. Outside the window, the frost was burning off the grounds in the morning sun. The old oak along the east fence was bare and dark against a pale sky. The stone wall her grandfather had built stood solid and unchanged. She picked up her pen and continued writing. The estate was hers. The law was on her side. And the man who had underestimated her for 3 years was at this very moment sitting in Whitmore Manor, believing the problem would resolve itself when she came home. Eleanor Ashford had no intention of going home. She had finally arrived at 1. The letters went out before breakfast. Eleanor had been awake since 4 in the morning, writing by candlelight at her father's desk. And by the time Arthur Mercer arrived at 8, with fresh copies of the original inheritance documents tucked under his arm, she had already filled 12 pages in her clean, precise hand and was on her 3rd cup of tea. Mercer looked at the stack of sealed correspondence on the corner of the desk and said nothing for a moment. Then, "You've been busy." "I've been preparing." Eleanor pushed the stack toward him. The one addressed to Mr. Blackwell goes by private courier, not post. The 3 addressed to London go together, same courier, same day. The one for Lady Harrington goes separately, and I need you to deliver it yourself, personally, not through her household staff. Mercer picked up the envelope addressed to Lady Harrington and turned it over once. "May I ask why separately?" "Because Lady Harrington's husband is on the board of the same investment syndicate that Nathaniel has been courting for the past 8 months. And because Lady Harrington has been waiting for a reason to have a very particular conversation with her husband for considerably longer than that." Eleanor met Mercer's eyes. "I'm giving her that reason." Mercer set the envelope down carefully. The way a man sets down something he now understands is more significant than it appeared. "You've been planning this longer than last night." "I've been hoping I was wrong longer than last night," Eleanor said. "Planning requires certainty. I became certain approximately 4 hours ago when I finished reading Price's amended documents in full. She had found them in the file. Mercer brought the full text of Gideon Price's alterations, 37 pages of dense legal language that read on the surface like routine clarifications. But Eleanor had grown up in a house where legal documents were discussed at the dinner table. Her father had believed that women ought to understand the instruments of their own protection as thoroughly as the men who drafted them. He had read her the relevant sections of trust law when she was 14. He had explained coverture to her at 16, and explained with careful precision exactly how he had structured her inheritance to circumvent it. She had understood every word of Price's alterations. She had understood exactly what they were designed to do and exactly why they would fail. And she had understood something else, something colder and more important. The alterations were sophisticated. They had taken thought. They had taken time. They had taken the specific knowledge of a man who had spent months extracting information from a wife who trusted him completely. Every question Nathaniel had asked her, every conversation about the estate, every evening when he had shown interest in her father's arrangements, and she had been so grateful, so genuinely, painfully grateful for what she believed was his desire to understand her world. She had handed him everything he needed to take it from her. That knowledge sat in her chest like a stone. She was not going to let it paralyze her, but she was going to carry it because it was true, and Eleanor Ashford had always believed that true things deserved to be looked at directly, no matter how much they hurt. Mercer departed at 8:30 with the letters and strict instructions. Eleanor sat alone for exactly 12 minutes. She counted because she permitted herself the 12 minutes and no more, and then she stood, straightened her spine, and went to find her father's old steward to discuss the East Pasture tenant agreements. She had an estate to run, and she had never been better at running it than when she had something worth protecting. Nathaniel's second letter arrived 2 days later. The tone had changed. The first letter had been dismissive, confident. The letter of a man who expected compliance and was mildly inconvenienced by its delay. This one was different in ways that told Eleanor everything she needed to know about what had happened in those 2 days. The frayed edge of the handwriting, the sentences that started in one direction and turned abruptly in another, the fact that he had written and then crossed out and then written again in the final paragraph. Eleanor, I find your continued absence difficult to understand. The Alderton dinner was managed, but your absence was noted, and I was required to offer explanations I did not have. I understand you were upset by the incident at dinner. It was unfortunate and should not have happened, and I accept responsibility for allowing it. But surely this matter can be discussed privately between us, rather than through this extended absence, which is beginning to attract the very attention you claim to find distressing. Please return to Whitmore by the end of the week. We have matters to discuss that cannot wait. N. 3 things in that letter. First, he accepted responsibility, which meant someone had spoken to him. Not from conscience, from consequence. Some guest or acquaintance had made him understand that his laughter at the dinner table had been noted and judged in ways he had not anticipated. Second, matters to discuss that cannot wait. The investors. She had expected that. Lady Harrington had moved faster than Eleanor had dared to hope. Third, he had not mentioned Isabella Fairchild once, not by name, not by implication, not even the ghost of an acknowledgement. He had called the an incident, the way you call a broken vase an incident, and moved immediately to the consequences for himself. Eleanor set the letter on the desk, picked up her pen, wrote 4 sentences. Nathaniel, I am attending to estate matters that require my full attention. I will be available for correspondence at Ashford residence. Any matters of urgency may be communicated through your solicitor to Mr. Arthur Mercer. E.A. She sealed it and gave it to the footman. Then she went to her afternoon appointment with Mr. James Blackwell barrister, who had arrived from London on the 11 o'clock coach and was waiting in the front parlor with an expression that suggested he had already reviewed the documents Mercer had forwarded and found them precisely as interesting as she had indicated they would be. James Blackwell was 53, lean as a whippet, and possessed of the particular quality that Eleanor valued most in legal counsel. He was not theatrical. He did not perform his intelligence. He simply applied it with the economy and precision of a craftsman who has no interest in impressing anyone and every interest in producing work that will hold. He stood when she entered. She gestured for him to sit. They both sat. "Well," Eleanor opened. "Tell me what we have." "An exceptionally strong case," Blackwell said without preamble. "Your father's original trust instrument is nearly impregnable. The specific provisions he used are unusual. I've rarely seen them applied this carefully, and they hold under every modern precedent I've examined. Price's alterations are clever, but they are fatally dependent on a misreading of the 1808 statute that I believe any competent court would reject. Furthermore," he paused, and Eleanor recognized the pause of a man with something significant to deliver. "The alterations were never filed. Price has the completed documents in his London office, but they have not been submitted to any court or registry, which means your husband is currently operating on the assumption that this transfer of ownership is legally accomplished when it is in fact legally accomplished in no sense whatsoever." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "He believes he already has it," she said. "I believe so, yes. He has been behaving as though the Ashford holdings are available to him, the conversations with investors, the refinancing discussions. If any of his counterparties had conducted thorough due diligence, they would have discovered the discrepancy immediately. Apparently, they trusted his representations. They trusted his reputation," Eleanor said, "which is built on his family name and his charm and the general assumption that a man who presents himself with sufficient confidence must have something behind it." A pause. "He has borrowed quite heavily against both." "Yes." Blackwell looked at her steadily. "Mrs. Whitmore, Eleanor, I want to be direct with you about something. The legal case is strong. I have no significant doubt about the outcome if this reaches the proper court. However, the path to that court will be difficult. Your husband's counsel will attack your character, your motives, your conduct as a wife. They will claim you concealed assets. They will claim you acted deceptively. They will make arguments that are legally meritless but socially damaging, and they will make them in public. I know. Society will watch. There will be those who side with him regardless of the evidence because he is a man of established name, and because women who fight their husbands in court are uncomfortable for a certain kind of person to support. I know that too." Blackwell regarded her for a moment. "You've thought this through. I've had 3 years of a very instructive education." Eleanor folded her hands on the table. "Here is what I know, Mr. Blackwell. My father spent 30 years building this estate, and the last decade of his life protecting it from exactly this kind of threat. He did not do that so that I could surrender it gracefully to preserve anyone's comfort. The documents exist. The law is clear. I am asking you to use both." Blackwell nodded once. "Very well." He opened his case and began to lay papers on the table. "Then let's discuss strategy." What Eleanor did not know, could not have known from the quiet of Ashford residence, was what was happening 40 miles away at Whitmore Manor in those same hours. Nathaniel had been pacing since Tuesday. His study, which he had always thought of as his best room, the room that conveyed everything he wanted to convey about who he was and what he had built, felt smaller to him now than it ever had. The shelves of leather-bound books, the portrait of his father above the mantel, the broad mahogany desk that he had purchased specifically because it was the kind of desk a man sits behind when other men take him seriously. He stood at the window and watched his own grounds and thought about Eleanor's 4-sentence letter, which he had read 11 times. "Any matters of urgency may be communicated through your solicitor to Mr. Arthur Mercer." She had a solicitor. Of course she had a solicitor. Mercer had been the Ashford family's man for decades. But the framing of that sentence, the precision of it, matters of urgency, as though she were not his wife but his counterpart, as though this were a negotiation between equals rather than a domestic disagreement that needed to be settled before it caused him further damage with the investment syndicate, which it was causing. Lord Pemberton had sent a note. 2 other members of the syndicate had declined his invitations without explanation, which in polite English society was itself an explanation of the loudest possible kind. And Isabella, damn her, had chosen the worst possible moment for her little display of territory. He had told her he had been explicit that there were times and places, and a formal dinner with the county's most influential families was neither. But Isabella had her own ideas, and he had let her have them for long enough that correcting her had become complicated. He pressed his fist against the window frame and breathed. The problem, the specific, concrete, immediate problem, was that the investment meeting was in 6 weeks. He needed 3 things to happen before that meeting: Eleanor to return home, the Ashford financing documentation to be in order, and the whispers from the Alderton dinner to have died sufficiently that no one would ask questions he couldn't answer. He needed Eleanor back. That was the starting point. Everything else radiated from there. He picked up the pen and began a 3rd letter, then stopped. Put it down. A letter was the wrong instrument. She was returning his letters with 4-sentence responses that told him nothing except that she had Arthur Mercer a solicitor's protocol and no intention of being hurried. He needed to go to her. He had not been to Ashford residence since the first year of their marriage, when he had accompanied Eleanor on a visit to see some matter of estate business resolved. He remembered the house as smaller than he expected, solid and old, and without the kind of grandeur that Whitmore Manor had, the kind of grandeur his own improvements had achieved. He had looked around it and thought privately that Eleanor's gratitude toward him must be considerable, given the difference in their circumstances. I understood now, with an unpleasantness that sat low in his stomach, that he had read those circumstances entirely wrong. He ordered his horse saddled. Eleanor was reviewing a tenant rental agreement in the library when Mrs. Hooper, who had been the Ashford housekeeper for 22 years, appeared in the doorway with an expression that managed to convey both calm professionalism and complete editorial disapproval in the same arrangement of facial features. "Mr. Whitmore has arrived, ma'am, on horseback. He is in the front hall and has requested to see you." Eleanor did not look up from the document immediately. She finished the line she was reading, made a small notation in the margin, and then set the pen down. "Tell him I'll be 5 minutes." "Yes, ma'am." A pause. "Shall I offer him refreshment?" "Tea," Eleanor said. "Nothing else." She sat for those 5 minutes without moving. Not to compose herself, she was already composed. But because the timing mattered. Because Nathaniel arriving on horseback rather than by carriage told her he had come impulsively, which meant he was rattled. And rattled, men needed to wait long enough to know that the person they were waiting for was not rattled at all. When she entered the front parlor, he was standing by the window. She had expected that it was where he always stood when he was uncomfortable. It gave him something to look at, other than the person he needed to face. He turned when she came in. And for a moment, just a moment, she saw something in his expression that she recognized from the early years. Something unguarded, something almost uncertain. Then it closed up again. And he was Nathaniel Whitmore, estate owner, charming and assured, wearing the expression he wore when he wanted something, and had decided that directness was the most efficient route to getting it. "Eleanor." He moved toward her. She did not move toward him. She sat in the chair beside the fireplace and gestured toward the one across from it. He stopped. Then he sat. "You look well." "Thank you for coming, Nathaniel." A beat. He had expected something else, some warmth or some recrimination. Her politeness threw him slightly. She could see it in the small adjustment he made to his posture. "I should have come sooner. I want to—" He stopped, recalibrated. "The evening at dinner was unacceptable. What happened to you should not have happened." "No," Eleanor agreed pleasantly. "It should not have. Isabella behaved very badly, and I have made that clear to her." Eleanor looked at him with the particular quality of attention that had always made him slightly uncomfortable, and he had never been able to explain why. "Have you?" "Yes." A pause that was slightly too long. "Eleanor, I need you to come home. I understand you were hurt. I understand the evening was mortifying, and I take responsibility for allowing it to occur. But there are pressing matters at Whitmore that require both of us to present a united—" "The investment syndicate," Eleanor said. He stopped. "Lord Pemberton's group," she continued in the same pleasant tone. "The refinancing discussions, the expansion plan, the meeting in 6 weeks." She tilted her head very slightly. You need your wife present because your investors are asking questions about your domestic stability, and you cannot afford to answer those questions poorly." The silence that followed was not comfortable. Nathaniel's jaw shifted. Something moved behind his eyes that was not quite anger, and not quite fear, and was. Eleanor thought the beginning of understanding. She watched it happen. She did not help it along. "How do you know about the syndicate meeting?" His voice was carefully modulated. Careful in a way it had not been 30 seconds ago. "I know a great many things," Eleanor said. "I always have. You simply never asked." He leaned forward. And here was the part of Nathaniel that she had once genuinely loved, the part that appeared in moments of pressure, the directness underneath the charm. "What is it you want, Eleanor? Tell me plainly. Do you want an apology? Do you want me to send Isabella away? I'll do it. Whatever it takes for you to come home and for us to manage this situation before it damages both of us." Eleanor looked at her husband of 3 years. The man she had married with a full heart and real hope, and the intention of building something that lasted. The man who had laughed. "I want," she said with great deliberateness, "to speak with your solicitor." Another silence, longer than the first. "My solicitor." "Mr. Gideon Price." She watched his face with calm, complete attention. "I'd like to discuss the documents he has been preparing on your behalf." What happened to Nathaniel Whitmore's expression in the 3 seconds that followed that sentence was something Eleanor had prepared herself to witness and still found almost painful to observe. Not because she felt sorry for him, she had moved past the place where his discomfort was her primary concern, but because she had loved this man. And watching the moment, he understood that the advantage he had believed absolute was not an advantage at all, was watching the collapse of something she had once invested her entire future in. The color left his face. His hands resting on the arms of the chair went very still. "Eleanor." "Price never filed them," she said simply. "I assume you know that. I assume you were waiting for the right timing, the investment meeting perhaps. The moment when the financial arrangements were sufficiently advanced that a legal challenge would be difficult to mount." She paused. "You waited too long." He stood. And now the uncertainty was something else entirely. It was the motion of a man whose ground has shifted and who has not yet found his footing. "How did you? Who told you?" "No one told me." Her voice was even and unhurried. "I read the documents, Nathaniel, all 37 pages. My father taught me to read legal documents when I was 14 because he believed his daughter ought to understand the instruments of her own protection." She looked up at him. He was right. Nathaniel crossed the room in 3 strides. He stood in front of her, and she felt the full force of his physical presence, the height and the breadth of him, the energy that had made a room look at him when he entered, the quality that she had once found so compelling, and now recognized for what it had always partially been, a tool he used to make people feel smaller. She did not feel smaller. She looked up at him from her chair with the steady, unhurried gaze she had been practicing since she was 8 years old, and her father had told her for the first time that the most powerful thing a person could do in a difficult moment was remain entirely still. "You need to sit down," she said. And because there was nowhere else to go, no move left on this particular board, he did. "Here is what is going to happen," Eleanor said. "Mr. Blackwell, who is my barrister, will be in contact with your solicitor. Your legitimate solicitor, not Price, within the week. The matter of the Ashford estate ownership will be resolved through the proper legal channels. Mr. Price's alterations will be submitted as evidence of attempted fraud, which they are. The original inheritance documents, which are fully lawful and entirely unambiguous, will be upheld." Nathaniel's voice, when it came, was low and stripped of everything. The charm, the confidence, the ease that he wore, so naturally, she had sometimes forgotten it was something he wore. "Eleanor, what I did, what I attempted, was planned," she said, "carefully, over years. You extracted information from me under the pretense of a husband's interest in his wife's affairs. You used that information to draft documents designed to transfer my inheritance to yourself without my knowledge or consent." She paused. "I need you to understand that I am not telling you this in order to discuss it. I am telling you so that we are both clear about what we are talking about." He put his head in his hands. And Eleanor watched him do it, and felt the ache again, the one she had learned to live beside, and thought that grief was a complicated thing, because you could grieve something and still know with absolute clarity that you could not have it back. "The investors will withdraw," he said. His voice was muffled. "When this becomes known, if Price's documents become public, my reputation—" "Yes," Eleanor said quietly. "I know." He looked up. His eyes were searching her face for something, mercy perhaps. Leverage. The particular expression of a person who has discovered they have no leverage and is trying to determine whether pity might serve in its place. "Is there anything?" he began. "No," she said, not unkindly, but finally. She rose, smoothed her skirt, looked at him for a moment. This man she had married, this mistake she had made with the best possible intentions, and she thought about the coin. Isabella's perfect voice. Nathaniel's unguarded laugh. The moment she had understood fully, and without remaining hope, that she was alone inside this marriage in every way that mattered. "You should have asked me," she said. "That's the thing I keep returning to. Not the documents, not even the betrayal. You should have simply asked me. If you had been in financial difficulty, if Whitmore was over-leveraged, if you needed help." She looked at him steadily. "I would have helped you, because I loved you, and because I had the means, and because that is what a marriage is supposed to be." A pause. "You never asked. You calculated instead. And the reason you calculated instead of asking is that you never believed I was someone worth asking." Nathaniel said nothing. There was nothing left to say. She walked to the door and paused. "Mr. Mercer will be in contact with your household about the arrangements. I would suggest engaging a new solicitor, someone with a cleaner reputation than Price's. You'll need good counsel for what comes next." She left him there. She did not look back. That evening, Eleanor sat at her father's desk long after the candles had burned low, and she wrote in the journal she had kept since she was 12 years old. The one with the worn green cover that lived in the locked drawer, with the property surveys, and the inheritance documents, and the other things she kept close because they were hers. She wrote, "He came today. I was ready. I did not cry, which surprised me slightly. I had expected to after. I think I used all the tears up during those first 2 years when I was still trying to understand what was happening and still hoping I was wrong. By the time I was certain, there were no tears left for the certainty. Only the next thing." She paused, looked at the window. The grounds outside were dark and cold and entirely hers. She wrote, "The next thing is the court. Blackwell says 6 weeks, perhaps 8. Society will watch. Some of them will be cruel. I've been underestimated for 3 years in polite company. I can manage cruelty for 8 weeks in a courtroom." She wrote, "I carry his coin still, in the left glove. I don't know why precisely. Perhaps because it is in the end the truest thing he ever showed me." She closed the journal, locked the drawer. Outside the window, the grounds of Ashford stretched in darkness, solid and real, and full of the kind of permanence that careful people build over generations. Stone walls and old oaks, and the deep stubborn roots of something that was never, despite every attempt to tell it otherwise, anyone's to take. Eleanor Ashford blew out the candle. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The letter from Nathaniel's new solicitor arrived on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after his visit to Ashford residence. Eleanor read it standing at the hall table, still in her riding coat, her gloves not yet removed. She read it once quickly, then again slowly, the way her father had taught her to read any document that mattered, first for the surface meaning, then for what lived underneath it. The surface meaning. Nathaniel's new solicitor, a Mr. Edmund Harcourt, of the firm. Harcourt and Wells was requesting a private meeting between the parties before any formal legal proceedings commenced. He framed it as an opportunity for mutual resolution. He used the word amicable 4 times in 6 paragraphs. What lived underneath it, Nathaniel was frightened. Eleanor handed the letter to Arthur Mercer, who had arrived that morning and was standing precisely 2 steps behind her left shoulder, which was where he always stood when something significant was about to happen. "He wants to settle," she said. "He wants to avoid the courtroom," Mercer agreed. "Which is not quite the same thing. A settlement at this stage would almost certainly be structured to minimize the public record of what Price was attempting to do. He wants the documents buried. He wants the documents buried, yes. Eleanor pulled off her writing gloves one finger at a time. Write to Mr. Harcourt. Tell him that Mrs. Whitmore thanks him for the correspondence and that she has instructed her barrister that all future communications should be directed through Mr. Blackwell's office. She handed the letter back to Mercer. And tell Blackwell the answer is no. She walked past him toward the library. At the doorway, she stopped without turning. Also, Arthur, find out everything you can about Gideon Price, his other clients, his other projects. I want to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with before we walk into that courtroom. Mercer's voice was measured as always. You believe there are others. I believe a man who will do this once will do it again, Eleanor said. And I believe the court will want to know that. What Mercer found in the following week regarding Gideon Price changed the nature of the case entirely. Price had 5 other clients with similar arrangements. 5 other women, 2 widows, 1 heiress whose father had died before she was 22. Women whose property had come through complicated family trusts, whose estates had been quietly mapped their legal protections. Gently undermined documents drafted in that same sophisticated language designed to look like clarification while functioning as theft. Price had been doing this for 11 years. Of his 5 other clients, 2 had already lost their property and did not know it. 1 had died, and her estate had passed apparently seamlessly to a husband who had arranged the transfer so carefully that even her own children hadn't questioned it. 1 was fighting a case in the London courts that had stalled for 2 years because she had insufficient documentation and counsel who did not understand what they were looking at. 1, a Mrs. Charlotte Aldridge of Cambridgeshire, had discovered the scheme 3 months prior and gone silent, which Mercer's sources indicated meant she had been pressured into silence rather than choosing it. Eleanor sat with this information for 1 full evening. She sat with the fire and her journal and the weight of what it meant not just for her case, but for what Price had built over 11 years and for the women on the other side of it. The next morning she wrote to Mrs. Charlotte Aldridge. She also sent a note to Mr. Blackwell. The case was no longer about the Ashford estate alone. Blackwell came to Ashford residence 2 days later and sat across the library table from Eleanor with the expression of a man who has just been handed a case that has grown substantially more significant than the one he agreed to take. You understand what you're proposing, he said, spreading Mercer's findings across the table. I'm proposing that we prosecute the full scope of what Price has done, Eleanor said, which means we need the other women's testimony, the documentation from their cases, the pattern of conduct, not just the single incident. It will extend the timeline, significantly. The syndicate meeting. The syndicate meeting can proceed or not proceed as it chooses, Eleanor cut in. My concern is not Nathaniel's investors. My concern is the other women who are currently sitting in houses that are being legally stripped from underneath them while they believe themselves to be safe. She looked at Blackwell directly. You told me my father's trust instrument was unusual. You told me most women don't have that protection. These women didn't. Which means the only thing that saved my estate from Price was my father's foresight. Not the law itself, not the system. One careful man's foresight. Blackwell was quiet for a moment. I need you to understand the personal cost, he said finally. A broader case means a longer fight, more exposure, more opportunity for Nathaniel's counsel to attack your character in public. There will be coverage in the papers. There will be, Mr. Blackwell. Eleanor's voice was steady and without heat. I have been managing the cost of underestimation my entire adult life. I am not afraid of the papers. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he gathered his documents and began making notes. Very well. I'll need 3 weeks to contact the other parties and assess whether they're willing to participate. I also need to approach the court about expanding the filing. Do it. Eleanor stood. And James, one more thing. When you contact Mrs. Aldridge, tell her that she is not alone. A pause. Tell her someone is coming. The courtroom hearing was scheduled for the first week of February 1819. The night before it opened, Eleanor did not sleep. Not from fear she had made her peace with what was coming, but from the particular restless alertness of a person who has prepared for something so thoroughly that their body cannot believe the preparation is complete and keeps searching for one more thing to do. She rose at 4, went to the library, sat at her father's desk, and opened the journal to the last page she had written. She did not write anything new. She simply read what was there, the entries from the past weeks, the record of every meeting and every letter and every decision, the account of herself navigating the worst betrayal of her life, with her hands steady and her mind clear, and her father's voice somewhere in the back of everything reading her the relevant sections of trust law when she was 14. Then she closed the journal, locked the drawer, put the key on the chain at her neck. She went upstairs, dressed without assistance, ate breakfast at a properly set table, the way she had been taught, and at 8:30 she walked out to the waiting carriage and took her seat with the composed certainty of a woman who knows, regardless of what happens next, that she has done everything right. The courtroom was full. Eleanor had expected attention. Blackwell had warned her twice that the case had attracted significant interest from the press and from society figures who were not accustomed to this particular kind of domestic dispute being aired in public. What she had not expected was how physical that attention felt when you walked through the doors into it. The eyes, the immediate and total shift in the room's energy, the silence that fell sharp-edged as she took her seat behind the barrister's table. She heard the whispers begin almost immediately, the particular whisper texture of a room full of people who have opinions formed in advance and are currently deciding how to weight them against what they are actually seeing. What they were seeing, she knew, was a woman in a dark gray dress without ornament, sitting with her back straight and her hands folded, looking at no one in particular, and appearing to find the proceedings unremarkable. Which was not the same as feeling unremarkable, but Eleanor had learned long ago that the appearance was the armor, and the feeling was something you kept inside it. Nathaniel was already seated across the room. He had brought Harcourt, who was good polished and competent and experienced in the particular art of making inconvenient truths sound like reasonable misunderstandings. Nathaniel did not look at Eleanor when she entered. That told her something. The man who never noticed her was now very carefully not noticing her, which was an entirely different thing. Isabella Fairchild was not present. Eleanor had not expected her to be. The proceeding opened. Blackwell was methodical and unshowy, which was exactly the right choice in a room that was already somewhat theatrical of its own accord. He laid out the timeline with precision, the original trust instrument, Price's engagement, the 37 pages of alterations, the pattern of extraction that had preceded them. He introduced the documents with the calm clarity of someone presenting arithmetic rather than argument. Then Harcourt rose, and Eleanor, who had prepared herself, felt the first real test of her composure begin. "My lord." Harcourt opened with the measured confidence of a man who has done this many times and found it effective many times. "What we are asked to consider today is not simply a property dispute. We are asked to determine whether a wife, over the course of 3 years, deliberately concealed substantial assets from her husband, whether she entered into a marriage with specific deception in mind, and whether the actions taken by my client's advisor were in fact reasonable responses to a situation in which he was denied the financial transparency that any husband has legitimate standing to expect." A pause. A look around the room. The practiced pause of a man timing his performance. "Mrs. Whitmore is not. I submit the aggrieved party here. Mr. Whitmore is." The room moved. Not dramatically, a ripple, a subtle realignment. Some of the faces that had been sympathetic toward Eleanor shifted into something more uncertain. Eleanor felt it without looking. She kept her hands folded. She kept her expression precisely where it was. Blackwell leaned slightly toward her. "This is where it starts." "I know," she said quietly. "Let him go." Harcourt went. For 40 minutes, he constructed a version of events in which Eleanor was the architect of her own misfortune. A wife who had hidden her wealth, complicated her husband's legitimate financial planning, and then manufactured a legal crisis from what ought to have been a private domestic matter. He was good. She could admit that. The story he told was coherent, and it hit every pressure point the discomfort people had with women who controlled their own property. The assumption that a wife's concealment was inherently suspect, the vague unease that this whole proceeding was somehow improper in a way that was difficult to name precisely. When Harcourt sat down, Eleanor looked at Blackwell. "Your witness," she said. Blackwell stood. He called Arthur Mercer first. Mercer gave testimony with the measured authority of a man who has kept 37 years of impeccable records and whose recollection of every document, every date, every legal provision was sharp enough that Harcourt's cross-examination produced nothing useful. Mercer was the kind of witness who made opposing counsel look smaller simply by being entirely precise. Then Blackwell called the surveyor who had conducted the most recent Ashford property assessment. He called 2 members of the Ashford tenant community who had made their rental agreements directly with Eleanor rather than through Nathaniel's steward, which established unambiguously that she had been actively managing the estate throughout her marriage. He called the banker who had refused Nathaniel's initial attempt to refinance against the Ashford holdings, who testified with visible discomfort that Mr. Whitmore had never disclosed the existence of the trust restrictions when he made his financing inquiry. And then Blackwell called Mrs. Charlotte Aldridge of Cambridgeshire. The room shifted again. Different this time. This was not the uncertain ripple of before. This was the sharper movement of people suddenly understanding that the story was larger than they had realized. Charlotte Aldridge was 42, small and quietly dressed, and she walked to the witness position with the particular steadiness of a person who has been frightened for a long time and has recently decided to be frightened no more. She sat. She folded her hands. She looked at Blackwell and waited. The testimony she gave was 40 minutes long. It named Price. It named his methods. It described in precise and careful detail the same pattern of document alteration that had been applied to her own inheritance, the same sophisticated language, the same targeted misreading of protective statutes, the same approach of working slowly enough that the victim had no reason to notice until the damage was done. She named the other women she knew of. She named dates. She named amounts. The courtroom was very quiet by the time she finished. Harcourt rose for cross-examination and faced a woman who had spent the past 3 months doing what women in her position so rarely had the opportunity to do, preparing. She answered every question he put to her with a composure so complete that twice he abandoned a line of questioning mid-sentence because it was producing nothing useful. When Charlotte Aldridge stepped down, she walked past Eleanor's table. She did not stop, but she met Eleanor's eyes for a moment that carried in it everything. 2 people can communicate when they have been through the same particular kind of invisible war and recognize each other from the other side of it. Eleanor gave the smallest nod. Charlotte Aldridge continued walking. Then it was Eleanor's turn. She walked to the witness position and sat. The room leaned forward. This was what they had come for, the wife. The woman at the center of it. The one who had walked out of the most elegant dinner party of the county season, carrying a single coin in her glove. Blackwell examined her first, and his questions were simple and well-constructed, designed to give her room to speak in complete thoughts, rather than compressed responses. He asked her about her father's intentions in structuring the trust. He asked her about her understanding of her own legal position at the time of her marriage. He asked her whether she had ever attempted to conceal the existence of the estate from Nathaniel. "No," Eleanor said. The word was clear and without qualification. "Did you discuss the estate with your husband during your marriage?" "Frequently." A pause. "He asked about it frequently. I answered him fully." "And the legal structure of the trust, the specific protective provisions your father had established?" "I informed Nathaniel of the general nature of the trust within the first year of our marriage. I told him the estate was held in my name under my father's arrangement. I did not go into the specific legal provisions because the specific legal provisions were not relevant to our daily life, and because, a breath, small, controlled. Because I believed at the time that we were building a marriage rather than conducting a legal negotiation." Blackwell sat. Harcourt rose. He came toward her with the controlled energy of a man who has been waiting for this moment and has specific plans for it. He was not hostile in his manner. That was a choice she recognized, designed to make her feel that his questions were reasonable, and therefore that resistance to them would appear unreasonable. "Mrs. Whitmore," Your father went to considerable lengths to ensure that your inheritance could not be accessed by your husband. Is that correct? My father went to considerable lengths to ensure my inheritance could not be taken from me without my consent, Eleanor said. That is correct. Taken from you? He tilted his head. An interesting choice of words. Your father, it seems, anticipated that your husband might attempt to take something from you. Would you say that's fair? My father was a careful man who understood the legal landscape his daughter would inhabit, Eleanor said. He prepared accordingly. And did you share his concerns with Mr. Whitmore before your marriage? I shared with Mr. Whitmore that I had an inheritance and that it was structured in a particular way. Yes. But not the specific protections. Not the specific legal provisions. No. So your husband, the man you married in good faith, did not know the full extent of your legal position. Eleanor looked at Harcourt steadily. My husband knew I had an estate. He chose to spend 3 years attempting to alter documents to transfer that estate to himself, rather than asking me directly about its legal structure. The question of who knew what might be more productively directed at him. A ripple moved through the courtroom. Harcourt pressed on. Mrs. Whitmore, isn't it true that at the time of your marriage, you were aware your inheritance could not be touched by your husband, and that this knowledge gave you a position of what? Eleanor's voice was quiet, but it had an edge now clean and precise. What is it you'd like to say I had? Harcourt shifted. A position of security, of independence, that your husband's financial situation was in some sense your leverage. The word dropped into the courtroom like a stone into still water. Eleanor let the rings expand. She waited. She looked at Harcourt with the particular quality of attention she had been using on people her entire life. The attention that sees clearly and refuses to perform confusion it does not feel. Mr. Harcourt, she said, and her voice was so even, so entirely unhurried, that the room had to lean in to catch every word. I married Nathaniel Whitmore because I loved him. I brought to that marriage a full heart and a considerable estate, and 3 years of genuine effort to build something worth having. I did not hide my wealth from him as a strategy. I did not conceal legal protections as leverage. I trusted him the way a wife trusts a husband, which is to say completely. And what I received in return. She paused. 1 beat. 2. Was a man who used my trust as a map to take from me what my father spent his life ensuring could not be taken. She looked at Harcourt without anger, without performance, with the simple, durable clarity of someone telling the truth. You ask me why my father built those protections. I think standing here today the answer is rather self-evident. The room was absolutely still. Harcourt said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then he said, "No further questions," and sat down. The recess was called at midday. Eleanor sat in the small anteroom that Blackwell had arranged, and she ate half of a sandwich she did not taste, and drank a cup of tea she barely felt, and she was fine. She was steady. She was the same person she had been when she walked in that morning, which was what she had promised herself she would be, regardless of what happened. Mercer came in during the recess. He set a folded note on the table in front of her. This was delivered for you. She opened it. It was from Nathaniel. 3 sentences written in that same bold, impatient hand that now felt to her like reading a foreign language familiar in its forms, but entirely changed in its meaning. Eleanor. Price turned over this morning. He has agreed to full cooperation with the court in exchange for leniency in his own proceedings. I did not know the full scope of what he had done to the other women. I want you to know that. She read it twice. Set it down. Mercer was watching her. Well, Price cooperated. She looked up. Which means the court has his full records, all 11 years, all 6 cases. The implications moved through her in sequence, clean and rapid. The case just changed. In your favor, Mercer confirmed. Substantially. Eleanor picked up her tea, drank it, set the cup down. And Nathaniel. Mercer hesitated for a fraction of a second, which was enough. He is speaking with Harcourt. There is discussion of a change in position. He's going to withdraw the opposition. It appears likely. Eleanor nodded slowly. She thought about the note. I did not know the full scope of what he had done to the other women. She turned this over. She held it up to the light, the way you hold a document up to the light to check the watermark. Did she believe it? She didn't know. What she believed was that it was possible to mean something true in the moment you said it, even if the preceding 3 years had been conducted without that truth in mind. She believed people were complicated. She had always believed that. It had never stopped her from holding them accountable. She folded the note and put it in her pocket. When the recess ended and the proceedings reconvened, Eleanor walked back into the courtroom and took her seat. She kept her eyes forward. She did not look at Nathaniel. Harcourt rose before the judge had fully settled. My lord, my client has requested a brief adjournment to reconsider the grounds of opposition in light of the new testimony and documentation provided this morning. The judge looked at him over his spectacles with the expression of a man who has been on the bench for 20 years and has developed very specific opinions about last-minute reconsiderations. Is this reconsideration likely to affect the fundamental position of the defense? A pause. Harcourt's pause. The pause of a careful man communicating as delicately as possible that yes, the fundamental position of the defense had just been destroyed by Gideon Price's cooperative testimony and the full weight of 11 years of documentation now in the court's possession. It is, my lord. Then I'll grant 30 minutes. The judge set his papers down. Not a moment more. Eleanor felt Blackwell exhale beside her, a long, controlled breath that communicated more about his professional tension over the past 3 weeks than anything he had said aloud. She did not move. From across the room, she heard Nathaniel's voice, low and urgent, speaking to Harcourt. She could not hear the words. She watched Harcourt's body language instead, the slight stiffening of a counsel who is receiving instructions that complicate his job. Harcourt replied in a murmur. Nathaniel's voice rose fractionally. Harcourt said something very quietly that cut the conversation off cleanly. 30 minutes later. Harcourt stood before the court and announced that the defense was withdrawing its opposition to the Ashford estate's ownership status. He phrased it in careful legal language. He cited new evidence. He said nothing about Price except to acknowledge that certain documentary submissions had been reconsidered. The judge received this without visible surprise. He had, it was clear, already read Price's testimony. He made several notes. He asked Blackwell 2 specific questions about the trust instrument that Blackwell answered with the precision of someone who has been waiting to answer them. He then addressed the room with the gravity of a man making an announcement he has been preparing for some time. The court finds that the Ashford estate, its holdings, properties, and associated legal instruments remains in the legal possession and ownership of Mrs. Eleanor Ashford Whitmore, as established by the original trust documents filed by the late Mr. William Ashford. Any alterations prepared by Mr. Gideon Price are found to be without legal standing and are hereby dismissed. A pause. Furthermore, the court is instructing the Attorney General's office to review Mr. Price's activities in connection with 5 additional cases identified in testimony today to determine whether criminal proceedings are warranted. The room erupted. Not in the theatrical way of a play's climactic scene. In the particular complicated way of a room full of people who have come to watch one story and have discovered it is a much larger story than they understood, who have opinions and reactions and discomforts, and some of whom are ashamed suddenly of the assumptions they walked in carrying. Eleanor sat through it. She did not cry. She did not smile. She waited until Blackwell touched her arm briefly, the professional equivalent of a salute, and then she stood and straightened her spine and walked out of the courtroom the way she had walked out of the Whitmore Manor dining hall 6 weeks before, without running, without looking back, with the composed, unhurried dignity of a woman who has always known exactly what she was worth. The cold air hit her face outside the courthouse steps. She breathed it in, long and slow. From somewhere behind her she heard Mercer following. From somewhere behind him she heard faintly the continued noise of the courtroom. She had left the voices, the movement, the complicated rearrangement of a world that had been very certain about things this morning and was considerably less certain now. Mercer came to stand beside her. He did not speak immediately. He was good at that. After a moment she said, "Find out the status of the 2 women who already lost their estates. I want to understand what legal remedies exist for them now that Price's cooperation changes the picture. I expected you'd want that, Mercer said quietly. And write to Charlotte Aldridge tonight. Tonight, Arthur. Not tomorrow. Of course. Eleanor looked out at the street. The carriages, the people going about their Tuesday afternoon lives, the ordinary ongoing world that had no idea what had just happened inside that building, or what it might given time and intention become. What's next, she said, is more important than what we just finished. She turned and walked to the carriage. Above the courthouse roof, the winter sky was the pale particular gray of a day that is ending, but not yet dark. That in-between hour, when everything is still possible, and the night has not yet arrived to close it down. The carriage door opened. Eleanor stepped in. The work ahead was significant. She had known that from the beginning. A courtroom victory was a door opening, not a destination. But Eleanor Ashford had never been afraid of what came after a door opened. She had been walking through them her whole life. She settled back into the carriage seat. Mercer climbed in across from her. They did not speak for several minutes, the silence of two people who have done something together that deserved a moment of recognition before the next thing began. Finally, Mercer said very quietly, "Your father would have been proud." Eleanor looked at her hands. The left one where the glove covered the place she had kept the coin. She had brought it with her today. She hadn't been sure why until this moment. She opened the glove, looked at the shilling. The king's profile worn slightly by 6 weeks of handling. One coin. Tossed onto a plate by a woman who wanted to humiliate. Carried into a courthouse by a woman who used it instead as a reminder. Yes, Eleanor said. I think he would have. She closed the glove. The carriage moved. The papers ran the story on Thursday. Not just the London papers, the County Gazette, the regional broadsheets, two of the society publications that Eleanor had always privately considered more fiction than journalism. By Friday morning, copies had reached Yorkshire. By Saturday, a letter arrived from Edinburgh, written by a woman Eleanor had never met, who had read an account of the proceedings and wanted to know if anyone was looking into a similar situation in her own family's estate arrangements. Eleanor added the letter to a growing stack on the corner of her father's desk. The stack had started the morning after the courthouse. It was now 14 letters tall. She read each one carefully. She answered each one personally. She did not have time to do this, and she did so anyway, because she understood in the precise, unromantic way she understood most things, that the stack was not a distraction from the real work. The stack was the real work beginning. Mercer found her on Saturday afternoon, surrounded by letters. The fire low, 3 empty teacups arranged around her like evidence of sustained effort. "You should rest," he said with the tone of a man who knows he is correct, and equally knows he will be ignored. "I'll rest when Charlotte Aldridge has her estate back," Eleanor said without looking up. "What did the Attorney General's office say?" Mercer sat down across from her. He laced his fingers together in the particular way he had when he was about to deliver information that was good news wrapped inside a complicated situation. "They are opening formal proceedings against Price on 6 counts. The 2 women who lost their estates are included. The question of recovery is not simple. The properties changed hands in some cases. There are mortgage arrangements, secondary interests. Is it possible?" A pause. "With time, and with the right legal arguments, and with a great deal of patience from the women involved." "What do they need from me?" Mercer looked at her steadily. "Eleanor, you have just won a significant legal battle after 6 weeks of preparation and 3 years of a very difficult marriage. You do not owe these women, Arthur." Her voice was quiet, final. The voice that ended conversations of this particular type. "What do they need?" He exhaled, opened his folder. "Testimony primarily. Your barrister's involvement in building the argument. Blackwell is already interested, I've spoken with him. And money, ultimately. Legal processes of this complexity are expensive, and several of the women have limited access to independent funds because their estates are the very thing in question." Eleanor set her pen down. She looked at the letters on her desk. 14 of them, each one a woman somewhere writing to another woman she had never met because she had read a newspaper account and thought for the first time in a long time, maybe someone will help. Draft me a formal arrangement, she said. Something that allows me to provide legal funding without creating any legal dependency on my own estate. I want it clean and documented. I don't want anyone to be able to claim later that I was creating my own kind of obligation. Mercer nodded. He made a note. And find out when Charlotte Aldridge can travel. I want to meet her in person before the end of the month. He made another note. And Arthur? She picked up the letter from Edinburgh. Find out if Price had associates, colleagues, other lawyers working in the same... She searched for the word. The same trade. Mercer looked up from his notes. His expression was the expression of a man who has just realized the conversation he is in is considerably longer in its scope than the one he arrived expecting to have. You think this is a network. I think Price is 61 years old and has been doing this for 11 years and has 5 known cases, Eleanor said. I think a man who has been doing something for 11 years and is still doing it at 61 either learned it from someone else or taught it to someone else. She set the Edinburgh letter on top of the stack. I want to know which. What was happening 40 miles away while Eleanor built her stack of letters into something that would eventually become the legal foundation for 3 estate recovery cases and 1 criminal prosecution network was a different kind of reckoning altogether. Nathaniel Whitmore had returned to Whitmore Manor after the courthouse proceedings and had not left it in a week. He was not hiding. He was assembling. That was the word his steward used in a carefully worded communication to his London banker, trying to explain the situation without explaining it. Mr. Whitmore is assembling his position. The steward meant it financially. It meant something else entirely. The investors had withdrawn. Not all at once, that would have been dramatic, and these were men who preferred the appearance of reasoned decision over the reality of rapid retreat. They withdrew in sequence, each citing some variation of changed circumstances, revised assessment of risk, desire to pursue alternative arrangements. The last one sent a letter that was so carefully worded in its not saying anything that Nathaniel had read it 4 times before he understood it was a no. With the investors gone, the expansion was dead. With the expansion dead, the debt he had accumulated in anticipation of it sat against properties that were not performing at the level he had projected and could not now be serviced at the rate he had committed to. He called his remaining solicitor a legitimate firm, not Price, and received advice that was honest and therefore deeply unpleasant. The Whitmore family estate could be salvaged, but it required immediate and significant restructuring. It required selling 2 of the outlying properties. It required renegotiating the existing mortgages, which would involve conversations he did not want to have with men he did not want to have them with. It required, in short, that Nathaniel Whitmore become a man who asked for help rather than a man who took what he needed. He sat with that for 3 days. On the 4th day, Isabella Fairchild sent a letter. He almost did not open it. He held it for a full minute, understanding what it was before he broke the seal, because he knew Isabella's handwriting, and he knew that the particular slant of it on this envelope, tighter than usual, more controlled, meant she had written and rewritten before sending. He opened it. Nathaniel, I have read the accounts of the proceedings. I believe it would be best for both of us if we did not continue our current arrangement. I have always valued your companionship, and I hope you know that nothing in my actions at the dinner was intended to create the consequences that followed. Yours I.F. He read it once, set it on the desk, looked out the window for a considerable time. She was not wrong. She was not even in her way unkind. She was simply doing what people do when the person they have aligned themselves with is no longer advantageous to align with. She was departing with as little drama as the situation allowed, and she was framing the departure in language that minimized her own responsibility while acknowledging it just enough to seem honest. Nothing in my actions was intended to create the consequences that followed. A single coin on a plate, intended precisely to humiliate, intended precisely to establish territory, intended to communicate in front of 40 witnesses exactly what Isabella Fairchild believed Eleanor Whitmore to be. And Nathaniel had laughed. He had not remembered laughing until the day after the dinner, when 2 different people had mentioned it, separately, in tones that were carefully neutral in the particular way that means the speaker has a strong opinion they are choosing not to share. He had thought at the time that the laughter was minor, a reflexive social response, meaningless in context. The kind of thing that happens in a crowded dinner party when the room is loud and the wine is flowing and you react before you think. I understood now that Eleanor had not experienced it that way. I understood sitting alone in the study that had always been his best room and now felt like a cage he had built for himself and walked into voluntarily, that the laughter was not a small thing. That for a woman who had spent 3 years being quietly, consistently underestimated by society, by guests, by the very domestic structure of the marriage, she had committed to her husband's laughter. In that moment was the loudest possible confirmation of what she had been fearing was true. That she did not matter. That she had never mattered. That the man she loved saw her the way everyone else did, as peripheral, as fortunate, as something he had acquired and could therefore arrange as he saw fit. He pressed his fist against the window frame as he had done that day. She wrote him the 4-sentence letter. The gesture of a man who has energy he cannot discharge and no direction to discharge it in. What he could not explain, what he was not sure he had language for, because he had not been raised in a household that gave language to this kind of interior reckoning, was that the grief he was experiencing was not primarily about the investors, or the estate, or the proceedings. It was about something older and quieter and more difficult to name. He had married Eleanor Ashford, believing he was doing her a favor, not consciously, not with malice aforethought. But somewhere beneath the surface of every interaction, every question about the estate, every moment when he had looked across the dinner table at his quiet wife in her simple gown, and thought without ever putting the thought into words that the arrangement was clear. She had his name. He had her gratitude. The balance was settled. He had never asked her what she thought about anything that mattered to him. Not really. He had asked about the estate. He had asked about specific financial arrangements. He had asked questions that were in retrospect research. He had not asked her what she believed or what she feared or what she was working toward, or what she had loved about her father, or what she thought about the tenant agreements she managed with such quiet competence that he had never once thought to look at how she managed them. He had never asked because he had never genuinely believed the answers would be worth having. That was the thing that sat in his chest now, like a stone he could not move. Not the betrayal he could construct a narrative around the betrayal had been constructing. It was aware that he was constructing it and felt faintly ashamed of that awareness. But this other thing, this simple, devastating thing, he had lived alongside a remarkable woman for 3 years and had never once been curious about her. His mother arrived on the 9th day. Margaret Whitmore was 63, sharp as a letter opener, and the one person in Nathaniel's life who had never adjusted her opinion of him to match whatever he most needed to believe about himself. She arrived unannounced in the way she always arrived, simply present suddenly, with no preamble and no apology for the absence of one. She found him in the study, looked at the state of the desk, the half-written letters, the general atmosphere of a man who had been sitting in the same room for a week, telling himself he was thinking when he was primarily just sitting. "You look terrible," she said, taking off her gloves. "Good morning, Mother. Don't be polite. I didn't come here for politeness." She sat in the chair across the desk, the same chair Eleanor had once occupied, and she studied him with the particular attention of a woman who has watched this specific man his entire life and has never been entirely satisfied with what she saw. "I read the accounts, all of them." "I assumed you had. I want to hear it from you." Her voice was not gentle exactly. It was the voice of a woman who believes that the truth is better than kindness, and that the people you love deserve both. What you actually did. Not the legal version. What you did. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then he told her. Not the version he had told Harcourt. Not the version that made reasonable-sounding distinctions between what he had instructed Price to do and what Price had done with those instructions. The actual version. The one that began 4 months into his marriage when he realized the Ashford estate was not available to him as a financial instrument, and he had felt not anger exactly, something uglier. The assumption that he was owed access to it. The entitled bewilderment of a man who had gotten everything he wanted his entire life, discovering for the first time a door that would not open for him. His mother listened to all of it. She did not interrupt. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Your father would have done the same thing," she said finally. Nathaniel looked up. "Not the price part. Your father had some limits." Her voice was dry. "But the rest of it, looking at your wife and seeing what she had rather than who she was, treating her as an arrangement that had been satisfactorily concluded rather than a person you were still in the process of knowing." She paused. "Your father did that to me. I spent 15 years explaining to him through action, since he wouldn't hear it in words, that I was more than what I had brought to the marriage. He understood eventually. But it took me 15 years of very determined effort, and I was not always," a significant pause, "gracious about the methods." Nathaniel looked at his mother. He thought about the 15 years of his own childhood she was compressing into that sentence. The specific particular quality of his parents' marriage. The battles that were never labeled as battles. The adjustments that were never called anything but minor domestic arrangements. The gradual, hard-won recalibration of two people finding their actual level. "Eleanor is not going to spend 15 years, he said. "No," his mother agreed without sentiment. "She is not." "What do I do?" "What you should have done 3 years ago." His mother picked up her gloves. "Learn who she is. Not what she owns. Who she is." She moved toward the door and paused. "And do not go to her with that knowledge expecting to be rewarded for it. You don't get credit for discovering at 35 what you should have known on your wedding day." She left. He sat for a long time in the room she had vacated. Chepeng. He wrote her a letter that evening. Not the kind of letter he had been writing, the one structured around his needs, his timeline, his investors. A different kind. The kind a man writes when he has stopped trying to manage a situation and started trying to speak honestly into it, which is a different and considerably more difficult enterprise. He wrote for an hour. He crossed out more than he kept. He wrote, "Eleanor, I am not writing to ask anything from you. I want to be clear about that first, because I understand that every letter I have written before this one was in some form asking something. This one is not. I have been trying to understand these past weeks what I actually did. Not in the legal sense. I understand the legal sense entirely, and Harcourt has explained it to me with sufficient clarity that I will not require further education. I mean what I did in the simpler sense. What kind of man looks at his wife for 3 years and never asks her what she thinks about the things that matter most to her? What kind of man hears his mistress humiliate the woman he married and laughs? I do not have a good answer to either of those questions. I have worked very hard to construct answers that made me look reasonable, and I have recently run out of energy for that particular project. What I know is this: you are the most capable, careful, honest person I have ever been in close proximity to, and I spent 3 years treating you as though your primary relevance was what you owned. That is not something I can explain. I am not going to try to explain it. I am only telling you that I know it, because I think you deserve to know that someone has finally clearly understood what they had and what they did with it. I do not expect a response. I do not deserve one. I am writing because it is the most honest thing I can do right now, and honesty at this particular point in my life seems like the minimum I owe. N. He sealed it, sent it, went to bed. He slept better than he had in 3 weeks. Eleanor received the letter on a Wednesday. She was with Charlotte Aldridge. When it arrived, Charlotte had come for a 3-day visit that had become a working session of the best and most purposeful kind, the two of them at the library table with documents and maps of the Aldridge estate spread between them. Blackwell joining them by midday. Mercer moving in and out with additional records. It was, Eleanor thought, exactly the right kind of busy, the kind where you look up and discover 3 hours have passed and you have accomplished something real. The letter sat on the corner of the desk for 2 hours before she opened it. Charlotte saw her look at it once and then deliberately not look at it, and being a perceptive woman who had spent the past month learning among other things a great deal about Eleanor Ashford's particular qualities, said nothing. When Blackwell stepped out and Mercer went to consult a record in the hall, Eleanor picked up the letter. Charlotte picked up a document and read it with great attention, which meant she was looking at nothing and listening to everything. Eleanor read the letter. Once. She set it down. She was quiet for a moment. Well, Charlotte said, still studying her document. Is it one of the Attorney General's letters or something else? Something else, Eleanor said. Charlotte looked up. Eleanor's face was not distressed. Charlotte had never seen Eleanor distressed, had begun to wonder if distress was simply not a mode available to her, and had eventually concluded that it was available, but Eleanor had placed it somewhere high on a shelf, and was not reaching for it except in her own time and privacy. What her face showed now was something more complicated. The expression of a person reading a letter and discovering unexpectedly that it contains something true. Nathaniel, Charlotte said. Not a question. Nathaniel, Eleanor confirmed. Charlotte set her document down. She was quiet for a moment, with the kind of quiet that means, I have an opinion, and I am deciding whether you want to hear it. Tell me, Eleanor said. I don't know your husband, Charlotte said carefully. I only know what you've told me, which is not flattering, and what I've read in the accounts, which is also not flattering. But I will say, a pause. My own husband spent 2 years trying to take my mother's estate. He did it because he believed in the same basic way men of his kind believe these things, that he was entitled to it. When it became clear he was not going to succeed, he did not write me letters. He hired a second lawyer. She looked at Eleanor steadily. Whatever is in that letter, the fact that it exists is something. Eleanor looked at the letter. Yes, she said. It is something. She folded it, put it in the pocket of her dress, next to where she used to carry the coin. She had retired the coin to the locked drawer that morning. She had decided she was done carrying it. It had served its purpose. She did not need a reminder anymore of what she was protecting and why. Shall we get back to your East Pasture documentation? Eleanor said. Charlotte smiled, small and understanding. Yes, let's. Chahag. 3 days after Charlotte left, a different kind of letter arrived. This one was not from Nathaniel. It was from Lord Pemberton. Eleanor opened it with the particular wariness she reserved for correspondence from men who had been on the wrong side of her dinner table the night this all began and were now presumably recalibrating. Lord Pemberton wrote with the careful formality of a man who has done something that requires a certain amount of repair and is applying himself to that repair with the seriousness of a tradesman addressing structural damage. He wrote that he had followed the proceedings with interest. He wrote that he had discussed with several members of his social circle. Pemberton's social circle, Eleanor noted, was precisely the circle that had been whispering, married above her station, for 3 years, the nature of the Ashford estate arrangements, which he described as more considerable than had been commonly understood. He wrote that he wished to make an introduction at her convenience to a Mrs. Harriet Grove of Derbyshire, who had recently expressed concerns about her own estate arrangements to Lady Pemberton, and who might benefit from, he chose the phrase with visible care, Eleanor's expertise in this area. Eleanor read it twice. Then she set it face down on the desk and looked at the ceiling. Expertise. Lord Pemberton was referring with the most careful possible language to what had happened in the courthouse. He was referring to the woman who had stood in front of the room that had underestimated her for 3 years and had told the truth so clearly that even the people who had come to doubt her had been unable to continue doubting. He was, in his Pemberton way, asking for her help. She picked up her pen. She wrote back a single paragraph. She would meet with Mrs. Harriet Grove. She was available the following Thursday. She would appreciate it if Lord Pemberton would convey to his social circle that her particular expertise was now being applied more broadly, and that women with concerns of a similar nature were welcome to reach out to Mr. Arthur Mercer's office. She sealed the letter, set it with the outgoing correspondence. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the stack on the corner of her desk. 14 letters. Letters when the week started. 19 now. Tomorrow there would likely be more. She had set out to protect one estate. She had walked into a courthouse to defend one woman's inheritance against one man's carefully planned theft. What she was discovering with the quiet, absorbing interest of a person who has spent their whole life noticing things other people missed was that the courtroom had not ended the story. It had opened it. Mercer appeared in the doorway at 4:30 with a fresh folder and the expression of a man carrying information that is significant. The Attorney General's office, he said, would like to speak with you. Eleanor looked up. About Price's network. About Price's network, yes. And about... He opened the folder. A piece of information that came out of Price's cooperation testimony that was not included in the public record. She gestured for him to sit. He sat. He opened the folder. He set a single page on the table. She read it. Then she read it again. The page detailed a financial arrangement between Gideon Price and 3 members of the legal establishment, not solicitors in his network, but sitting members of the legal profession at a level considerably above Price's. Men who had known what Price was doing. Men who had in some cases referred clients to him. Men who had benefited in various carefully structured ways from the arrangements he concluded. Eleanor set the page down. She placed both hands flat on the table. She breathed in, out. How many cases total, she said, when you account for these 3? Mercer's voice was level, the voice he used when the information was severe, and he did not want to add to its weight by performing his reaction to it. Preliminary estimate is 23, over 14 years. 23 women, 23 estates, 23 families, fathers and grandfathers who had built things and tried to protect them and trusted a system that had been in this particular corner of it quietly for sale. Eleanor. Mercer's voice was careful now, careful in a different way. This is larger than anything we set out to do. The Attorney General's office has resources. They have jurisdiction. They do not need you to pursue this, they are already pursuing it. I know, she said. You have rebuilt the Ashford Estates management. You have supported Charlotte Aldridge's case. You have begun something real and substantial. You do not have to... Arthur. She looked at him. 23 women. He was quiet. 23 women who sat in rooms believing they were safe, who answered their husbands' questions out of love and trust, and the reasonable expectation that the person beside them was not taking inventory. She looked at the page. I sat in that room. I know what it feels like to be that woman. I know what it feels like to discover you were wrong about the person you trusted most. A pause. I'm not going to walk away from 23 women because the number is inconvenient. Mercer looked at her for a long moment. Then he closed the folder. I'll schedule the meeting with the Attorney General's office, he said. Tuesday, Eleanor said. Blackwell should be there. I'll arrange it. He left. Eleanor sat alone with the fire and the stack of letters and the particular stillness of a woman who has arrived somewhere significant and is pausing just for a moment to understand where she is before she takes the next step. She thought about Nathaniel's letter. The most honest thing I can do right now, and honesty at this particular point in my life, seems like the minimum I owe. She had not answered it. She was not yet sure whether she would. The answer to a letter like that was not something you wrote in a week. It was not something you wrote while you were still in the middle of discovering what had been done, how large it was, how many other lives it had touched. The answer required time and clarity and the kind of perspective that only came from the far side of something. She was not yet on the far side, but she could see it. For the first time since November, since the coin, the laughter, the cold night air outside Whitmore Manor, she could see it. Not reconciliation, not yet. Not certainty. But the shape of a future that belonged to her, and was being built by her, and was turning out to be considerably larger in scope than she had planned. Her father had protected one estate. Eleanor Ashford was beginning to understand she might protect many more. She picked up her pen. Started on the next letter. The stack grew. The meeting with the Attorney General's office lasted 4 hours. Eleanor had prepared for 2. She brought Blackwell and Mercer and a leather satchel containing every document, every letter, every piece of correspondence that connected Price's network to the 3 senior legal figures named in his cooperation testimony. She had organized the satchel herself at midnight, the night before, sitting at her father's desk, with the fire low and the house quiet, arranging documents in the precise sequence that would tell the story most clearly to people who were hearing it for the first time. The Attorney General's deputy was a man named Farthington. Careful, thorough, the kind of official who took notes in small, precise handwriting and asked the same question 3 different ways to make sure he had understood it correctly. Eleanor found him after the first hour genuinely impressive. He was not performing competence. He was simply competent, which was rarer than it should have been. What he told her in that fourth hour, after the preliminary discussion, after the document review, after the lengthy procedural explanation of how the criminal proceedings against Price and his associates would be structured, was the thing she had not expected. "Mrs. Whitmore." Farthington set his pen down. "We have a problem." Eleanor looked at him. "Of the 23 cases we've identified, 11 involve estates where the altered documents were filed with registries before Price's cooperation agreement was concluded. 3 of those filings were in jurisdictions where the reversal process is complicated. Legally complicated, I mean." He paused. "We can prosecute Price and his associates. We can almost certainly win those prosecutions. What we cannot guarantee under the current legal framework is that winning those prosecutions automatically restores ownership to the women affected." The room was very quiet. Blackwell, to Eleanor's left, had gone very still, the stillness of a barrister who has just heard something he already suspected and was hoping not to have confirmed. "Explain the gap," Eleanor said. "The criminal proceeding establishes that fraud was committed. It does not in itself constitute a civil remedy. Each woman whose estate was transferred under fraudulent documentation would need to pursue a separate civil action to reclaim it. Those actions are winnable. I want to be clear about that, but they require individual legal resources, individual barristers, individual proceedings. And the women most affected are by definition the ones who have the least access to those resources, because their assets are the very thing currently held under fraudulent claim." Eleanor looked at Blackwell. Blackwell looked at Eleanor. She turned back to Farthington. "What would it take to establish a legal precedent that covered all 11 cases under a single ruling?" Farthington blinked. "That would require a consolidated civil action, unprecedented in scope for this type of case. You would need to argue that the fraud constituted a systemic pattern rather than individual incidents, which is supportable from the evidence, and you would need a court willing to entertain that argument, which would require—" "A strong enough case," Eleanor finished. "And the right judge. And considerable resources," Farthington said carefully. "A consolidated action of that scope is not inexpensive." "No," Eleanor agreed. "It is not." She closed her satchel, straightened the latch, looked at Farthington with the clear, unhurried attention that Blackwell had come to think of over the past weeks as her most reliable weapon. "Give me 6 weeks," she said. Farthington opened his mouth, closed it. "Mrs. Whitmore, the Attorney General's office cannot officially endorse a private—" "I'm not asking you to endorse it. I'm asking you not to move forward with the individual prosecutions until I have had 6 weeks to build the consolidated argument." A pause. "If I cannot build it in 6 weeks, you proceed as planned and nothing is lost. If I can build it, you have a case that sets a precedent that protects women in this situation for the next 50 years, instead of resolving 11 individual claims in 11 individual courtrooms over the next decade." Farthington looked at her for a long moment. He picked up his pen, set it down again. "6 weeks, he said finally, "after which we proceed regardless." "After which you proceed regardless," Eleanor confirmed. She stood, picked up her satchel, and walked out of the building into the cold February air. Blackwell came out 30 seconds behind her, moving faster than his usual measured pace. "Eleanor." His voice had the particular quality of a man trying to determine whether he is alarmed. "A consolidated action of that scope requires— I want to be honest with you about the resources involved." "I know what it requires," she said. "Ed, can you build the legal argument?" "I can build an extraordinary legal argument," Blackwell said. "I've been building toward it since the moment Price's network size became clear. Whether the court will entertain it is a different. Can you build the argument?" A pause. The pause of a man being asked a direct question about his own capacity and deciding whether to hedge or answer. "Yes," Blackwell said. "I can build it." "Then build it." Eleanor turned toward the waiting carriage. "I'll handle the resources." She wrote to Nathaniel that evening. Not in response to his letter, not yet. She was not ready for that conversation in its full depth. But she wrote with a specific purpose in the plain, direct language she used when the content was too important for any kind of softening. She told him what she was building. The consolidated action. The 11 women. the scope of Price's network, and the gap in the criminal proceedings that left those women without automatic remedy. She told him what it would cost. She gave him a number accurate to within 10% based on Blackwell's estimate, because she had always believed that asking for something required being specific about what you were asking for. She was not asking from love. She was not asking from obligation. She wrote that clearly. I am asking because you have more liquid capital available than you should have given your current situation because you sold the 2 outlying properties rather than mortgage them further, and that was a smarter decision than I expected. I am asking because these 11 women lost what they lost in part because men in your precise social and financial position created a system in which it was possible to lose it. And I am asking because if there is anything real in what you wrote me last month, this is a concrete and specific way to demonstrate that something has changed. She sealed the letter. Then she picked up her pen again and wrote 11 separate letters, one to each woman whose estate was currently held under a fraudulent filing. She told them what she was doing. She told them she needed their testimony, their documentation, their willingness to stand before a court one more time. She told them she would provide the legal resources, the barrister, and the argument. She told them they were not alone. The stack of letters was 24 high when she finally put out the candle. Nathaniel's response arrived in 3 days, which was faster than she had expected. It was also shorter than she expected. 3 sentences. Eleanor, the amount you need is manageable. Mercer should contact my banker by Thursday. I've already spoken with him. Do with it what you've said you intend to do. N. She read it 3 times. Not because it was complicated, because it was not. No conditions. No requests for credit for acknowledgement for any form of return on the investment. No implication that this transaction created any obligation between them. Just yes. Here it is. Use it correctly. Charlotte Aldridge was at the library table across from her when Eleanor read it. Charlotte had been coming twice a week, now had become in the 6 weeks since the courthouse. Something that Eleanor was still not entirely sure how to categorize, closer than an ally, more substantive than a colleague. A friend, perhaps. The particular kind of friend you make in the middle of a shared difficulty who is made of the right materials. Charlotte watched Eleanor set the letter down with the expression of a woman who has learned not to ask questions directly. The resources question, Eleanor said. It's resolved. Charlotte looked at her steadily. Nathaniel. Nathaniel. A pause. How do you feel about that? Eleanor considered the question with genuine attention, the way she considered things that deserved real thought rather than reflexive answers. Complicated, she said finally. I feel complicated about it. I'm grateful for the practical resolution. I don't know what to do with the fact that he did it without asking for anything in return. She looked at the letter. I spent 3 years married to a man who calculated everything. That letter contains no calculations. People can surprise you, Charlotte said quietly. Sometimes in the wrong direction, sometimes in the other one. Eleanor folded the letter. Set it with the others she kept in the locked drawer. Not the property surveys this time, but the personal record. The things she kept because they were true, and because truth, even complicated truth, deserved to be preserved. Yes, she said. They can. She picked up her pen. Now, let's talk about your East Pasture documentation, because Blackwell needs it before Friday, and you keep telling me it's nearly ready. Charlotte laughed, a real laugh, not a polite one. It will be ready by Thursday. It will be ready by Wednesday, Eleanor said firmly, and they went back to work. The consolidated action was filed on the 1st of March. It was, as Blackwell had promised, an extraordinary legal argument. 47 pages built on the pattern evidence from Price's cooperation testimony, the individual documentation from all 11 cases, and a precedent argument drawn from 3 jurisdictions that no one in the Attorney General's office had thought to look at, and that Blackwell had found in a footnote in a 1791 property case he had read 15 years ago and never quite forgotten. The news of the filing ran in every paper within a week. This time the accounts were different. The first courthouse story had been covered with the slight discomfort of people reporting on a domestic dispute that had turned unexpectedly significant. This one was covered with the tone of people who understood they were watching something that mattered, something that would be cited and referenced and argued about for years in ways they could not fully anticipate yet, but could feel approaching. The letters came faster now. Not 14, not 24. Mercer counted 63 in the first week after the filing. He presented Eleanor with this number with an expression that was somewhere between professional pride and genuine concern for her sleep schedule. "We need more people," Eleanor said immediately. "Yes," Mercer agreed. "We do. Talk to Blackwell about who he trusts. Young barristers, good ones who are good because they are actually good, not because they come from the right families. And find me 2 solicitors who specialize in trust law who are not currently overextended." She was already looking at the stack. "And we need a proper office, Arthur. Not the library at Ashford. An actual office in London where women can send letters and have them received by someone whose full attention is on this work." Mercer looked at her. "You're building something." "I am building something," Eleanor confirmed. "I assumed that was clear." "It is now," Mercer said with the smallest possible smile. "Quite clear." The consolidated hearing was scheduled for April. 3 weeks before it, something happened that none of them had anticipated. One of the 3 senior legal figures named in Price's cooperation testimony, a man named Sir Gerald Ashton, who sat on the bench of a court that handled property disputes in the northern counties, announced his voluntary resignation. He cited personal reasons. The letter of resignation was published in the Gazette on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, every barrister in London understood that the voluntary resignation was not voluntary in any meaningful sense, and that Sir Gerald Ashton had been told by people with sufficient authority to tell him such things, that his options were resignation and investigation, or investigation alone. Eleanor read the Gazette account over breakfast. She set it down beside her teacup. She picked it up again. Set it down. Mercer, arriving at 9, found her standing at the window, with the Gazette still in her hand. "Ashton," he said. "Ashton," she confirmed. 30 years on that bench. How many cases did he handle, Arthur, in 30 years? How many women's property disputes came before him that he decided while knowing what Price was doing?" Mercer was quiet. "We need to look at his case record," Eleanor said. "Not for the consolidated action that's already filed, and we don't have time to broaden it. But after. We need to look at every property case that came before Ashton's court in the last 14 years and cross-reference with the names in Price's documentation." "Eleanor." Mercer's voice was careful. "That is years of work." "Yes," she said. "It is." She set the Gazette down, turned from the window. Her expression was not angry, which surprised him slightly. He had expected anger. What it was instead was the expression of a woman who has just received confirmation of something she already knew and is adjusting her estimates for the work ahead accordingly. "Write to Blackwell. Tell him we need to discuss the structure of the organization after the consolidated case concludes. We need something more permanent, something with standing to access case records." Mercer wrote it down. "That is a very significant thing you're describing." "I know," Eleanor said. "We'll take it one step at a time." She sat down at the desk. "Starting with April." April arrived, the way English spring arrives tentatively with cold mornings and bright afternoons, and the sense that warmth is a possibility rather than a certainty. Eleanor traveled to London 3 days before the hearing. She stayed at the Ashford family's London property, a townhouse off Grosvenor Square, that Nathaniel had never known about because she had never mentioned it, and he had never asked about the London holdings in sufficient detail to discover it. She had stayed there once during her marriage, under the pretense of visiting a friend, and had sat in her mother's old sitting room and felt the particular loneliness of a person who has things she cannot share with the person she is supposed to share everything with. She did not feel lonely now. Charlotte Aldridge was in the room across the hall. 2 of the other women, Mrs. Amelia Forsyth of Kent and a Mrs. Diana Rowe, whose estate in Lincolnshire had been transferred 18 months ago, were staying with respective contacts in the city, but came each evening to the townhouse for dinner. Blackwell arrived the afternoon before the hearing and sat in the parlor with Eleanor and Mercer for 3 hours, reviewing every possible angle of the argument and every potential countermove from the opposing counsel. Those opposing counsel were not Harcourt. Harcourt had extracted himself from the broader situation with professional delicacy, citing a conflict of interest, which was the legal equivalent of quietly leaving a burning building before anyone else noticed the smoke. The men facing Blackwell in the morning were hired by the institutions standing behind the fraudulent filings banks and property registries, and one particularly aggressive land trust that had acquired 2 of the 11 estates and was not inclined to give them back without a fight. "They'll argue procedural barriers," Blackwell said, spreading his notes on the parlor table. "The consolidated structure is novel. They'll say each case must be handled individually. They'll say the pattern evidence is insufficient to override individual legal instruments." "And you'll say," Eleanor prompted. Blackwell looked at her. "I'll say that the same hand wrote every instrument, that the same method, the same language, the same deliberate exploitation of the same legal gaps applied across 23 cases over 14 years is not a series of individual events. It is a single crime with 23 victims. And that treating it as 23 individual cases is not legal precision. It is a structural advantage extended to the people who committed the crime at the expense of the people who suffered it." The room was quiet. "Good," Eleanor said. "Say exactly that." The morning of the hearing. Eleanor woke at 5. She did not lie in bed. She rose dressed and went to the small writing desk in the corner of the room. She opened her journal. She had brought it from Ashford. She always brought it. It was as much a part of her traveling kit as her riding coat, and she wrote. "Today is the day. I am not afraid of it. I am ready for it in the way I am ready for things that matter, not calmly exactly, but clearly. I know what I am doing, and why I am doing it, and who I am doing it for, and those 3 things together are sufficient." She wrote, "Father, I hope you can see this. I hope wherever you are, you understand what the trust instrument became. It was supposed to protect one estate. It protected one woman. And that woman is now attempting to protect 23 others. I think you would approve of the arithmetic." She closed the journal, put on her gloves, looked in the mirror once, not from vanity, but from the same impulse that makes a soldier check their equipment before a battle. She was neat and precise and entirely herself. She went downstairs. Charlotte was already in the front hall, also dressed, composed with the expression of a woman who has been afraid and has moved through the fear to the other side of it. "Ready," Eleanor said. "Ready," Charlotte said. They went. The consolidated hearing lasted 2 days. The argument Blackwell made on the first day was, by any honest assessment, remarkable. Eleanor watched from behind the barrister's table as he built it layer by layer, precedent by precedent, the pattern evidence laid out with such clarity and such precision that the opposing counsel's procedural objections began to sound as the hours passed less like legal principle and more like the complaints of people who were losing and knew it. The opposing counsel was capable. They pushed hard on the novelty of the consolidated structure. They pushed harder on the question of whether pattern evidence could override individual legal instruments. They brought 3 expert witnesses who testified about the integrity of the filing process in language, so technical it seemed designed to exhaust rather than persuade. Blackwell handled all of it. Eleanor watched him work with the focused appreciation of someone watching a craftsman at the height of their skill. He did not perform. He did not theatricalize. He simply presented the truth in its clearest available form, and trusted the truth to do what truth does when given sufficient room. On the second afternoon, the 3rd of the 11 women gave testimony. Her name was Mrs. Frances Hollis. She was 61 years old, the widow of a man who had spent 30 years building an estate in Devonshire that was now held under a fraudulent instrument filed 2 years before his death, without his knowledge, against an inheritance his wife had brought to their marriage. She had fought it alone for 2 years before a letter from Arthur Mercer's office reached her. She had traveled from Devonshire for this hearing at her own expense, which she had managed because she had been careful all her life and had savings that Price's arrangement had not reached because they were kept in a form the scheme could not easily access. She was small and white-haired, and she spoke in the measured tones of a woman who has been angry for 2 years and has converted that anger through sustained effort into absolute precision. She described what had been taken. She described how it had been taken. She described the specific moment she discovered it, reading a letter from a tenant who had received notice that his rental terms were being renegotiated by a new management company she had never heard of, and realizing as she read the letter that the ground beneath her had been quietly removed while she was standing on it. When she finished, the courtroom was entirely silent. Eleanor was looking at her hands. She was thinking about her father's desk, and the locked drawer, and the property surveys, and the conversation with Arthur Mercer on the night she left Whitmore Manor. She was thinking about what it felt like to be the woman in that carriage. Certain at last. Finally certain about what had been done to her and what she was going to do about it. She looked up. The judge was making notes with the deliberate attention of a man who has made up his mind and is now constructing the written foundation for that decision. She knew then. She knew before the ruling. The way you sometimes know not from wishful thinking, but from the accumulated evidence of everything you've observed, the room, the faces, the quality of the silence, that the thing you have worked for is about to arrive. The ruling came on the third morning. The consolidated action was upheld. The judge's written opinion was 42 pages and would be cited in property cases for the next 60 years. Eleanor would not know that in April of 1819, standing on the courthouse steps, with Blackwell on one side and Charlotte on the other, and Mercer somewhere behind her, keeping his professional composure with admirable success. She would not know what the ruling would become, what it would mean, how many women in how many subsequent years would stand in their own courtrooms with their own barristers citing those 42 pages as the foundation of their argument. She only knew what it meant today. 11 estates, 11 women. The fraudulent filings overturned under a single consolidated ruling that established for the first time in English legal history that systematic fraud against women's property rights constituted a unified pattern of criminal conduct requiring unified civil remedy. Charlotte grabbed her hand. Both of them stood on those courthouse steps in the April morning and did not speak for a full minute, which was the most complete and appropriate response available to the situation. Then Blackwell appeared at Eleanor's elbow. He was not a man who showed emotion in the way that made other people comfortable. But his voice, when he spoke, had something in it that she had not heard there before. "Your father would have understood every word of that opinion," he said. Eleanor squeezed Charlotte's hand once, released it. "Yes," she said. "He would have." 3 weeks later, Nathaniel came to the London townhouse. He had written first a proper letter this time, a letter asking whether she would receive him, which was itself a kind of arrival at something different. Not requesting, asking, understanding that she had the choice. She wrote back one sentence Thursday at 2 o'clock. He arrived on Thursday at 2 o'clock. Not a moment early, not a moment late. She received him in the front parlor, and they sat across from each other the way they had sat in the Ashford Library 4 months ago, except that this time the ground between them was different, more honest, more damaged, and more accurately mapped. Howe was thinner than she remembered. His face had the look of a man who had spent several months doing something unfamiliar and difficult, which was, she suspected, the work of reckoning with himself. "The consolidated ruling," he said without preamble, without small talk. "I read it, all of it." A pause. "You did something extraordinary." "Blackwell did something extraordinary," Eleanor said. "I provided the resources and the determination. Don't minimize it," Nathaniel said quietly. "You walked into that courthouse in February with an argument no one had made before, and you made it. That was you." Eleanor looked at him. She was looking at him differently than she had looked at him 4 months ago. Not with the closed, careful attention of a woman protecting herself, but with something more open. Not without wariness, but open. "What do you want, Nathaniel?" she said. Not unkindly, with genuine curiosity. Howe was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that meant he had prepared for this conversation and was discovering that the preparation was insufficient for the actual moment of it. "I don't know," he said finally. "That's the most honest answer I have. I don't know if I want what I want to be possible. I know I spent 3 years with you and saw almost nothing of who you actually were. I know I laughed at something I should have walked across a room to stop. I know." He stopped. "I know that everything I was taught to want, the estate, the reputation, the expansion, the investors, all of it is less interesting to me right now than the question of how a person becomes the kind of man you deserve to be married to." A pause. "I don't know if that's too late. I genuinely don't know." Eleanor sat with that. She sat with it the way she sat with things that required real thought fully without rushing toward the comfortable answer. "I don't know either," she said. "And I'm not going to pretend I do." He nodded. He had not expected anything different. She could see that. "What I know," Eleanor continued, "is that I am building something that requires my full attention for the foreseeable future. The organization we're establishing in London, the remaining cases, the case record review from Ashton's court. There is a great deal of work ahead, and I intend to do it properly." She looked at him steadily. "I also know that the man who sent 3 sentences and no conditions and asked for nothing in return is not the same man who laughed at that dinner table. And I don't know yet what to do with that difference, but I am not going to pretend the difference doesn't exist." "That's more than I expected," Nathaniel said. "Don't read too much into it," Eleanor said, but her voice was not cold when she said it. He left at 3:30. She stood at the window and watched his carriage until it turned the corner. Then she turned back to the room, the desk, the correspondence, the next letter in the stack that never quite emptied. She sat down, picked up her pen. She thought briefly of the coin. It was in the locked drawer at Ashford now, with the journal and the property surveys, and Nathaniel's letters and the original trust instrument, all the documents of a life that had been tested and had held. 1 shilling. Tossed onto a plate by a woman who wanted to prove that Eleanor Ashford was nothing. What it had proven instead was the opposite of that. 6 months after the consolidated ruling, the organization opened its doors in London. It had a name, the Ashford Trust, which Eleanor had chosen not for pride, but for precision, because her father's name was the most accurate possible description of what the work was built on. It had an office on a quiet street off Fleet Street, staffed by 2 barristers, 3 solicitors specializing in trust law, and 2 women who had themselves been through the Price network and had come out the other side determined to be useful to others in the same position. Charlotte Aldridge sat on the board. Frances Hollis sat on the board. Mercer ran the administration with the quiet, comprehensive efficiency of a man who had been preparing for exactly this level of responsibility for 37 years without knowing it. On the day the office opened, Eleanor stood in the front room and looked at the shelves already filling with case files with letters, with the documentation of the ongoing review of Ashton's case record, which had so far identified 19 additional cases requiring examination. She looked at the 2 women at their desks, already working, already making the thing real with the ordinary daily effort of people who understand what they are doing and why. She looked at all of it and felt not triumph exactly. Triumph was for moments. What she felt was the quieter, more durable thing that comes after triumph has been processed and folded into the ongoing fabric of a life purpose. Direction. The sense of a person who knows exactly where they are standing and has decided it is exactly the right place to stand. Mercer came to stand beside her. "Letter from the Attorney General's office," he said, handing her an envelope. "They are requesting the Trust's formal cooperation in the 2nd phase of the Price prosecution. The 3 senior figures. It appears their own investigation has produced additional documentation they believe we should see." Eleanor took the envelope, did not open it yet. "Schedule a meeting for next week. I want Blackwell present." "Of course." He paused. "And a letter from Nathaniel. Separate from the official correspondence." She took the 2nd envelope, looked at it, put it in her pocket for later, for the evening when the office was quiet and she could read it properly and think about it properly and give it the honest attention it deserved. She was not ready to resolve that question. She might not be ready for some time. But she was no longer afraid of it, which was its own kind of progress. "Ready," Mercer said. Eleanor looked around the room one final time. The barristers at their work. The letters on the desks. the shelves beginning their slow filling with the documented record of women who had been wronged and were going to be heard. The ordinary, extraordinary, necessary work of it all. "Yes," she said. "Let's begin." Years later, when people spoke of the Ashford Trust, and they did speak of it in courtrooms, and in Parliament, and in the careful, grateful letters of women whose names no one would ever recognize, but whose estates remained intact because of the precedent built in those April proceedings. They spoke of Eleanor Ashford as though she had always been inevitable, as though the woman who walked out of that dining hall carrying a single coin had always been exactly this clear-eyed, purposeful, unbreakable. What they did not say, because they did not know, because she had never told anyone, except Arthur Mercer and the worn green journal in the locked drawer, was that she had not felt inevitable. She had felt afraid. She had felt the weight of 3 years of being seen as nothing, of having her worth defined by a man who looked at her and calculated rather than knew. She had sat in that carriage on the November night with the frost on the windows and the road dark ahead, and felt every bit of the grief that comes with understanding that the person you trusted most has been using you as a map. She had simply refused to let that grief become the final word, because the final word belonged to her. It had always belonged to her. Her father had made sure of that in ink and law, and the careful, loving attention of a man who knew his daughter was extraordinary long before the world was ready to agree. The coin stayed in the drawer. The estate stayed in her name. The trust carried on its work. And Eleanor Ashford, who had been called fortunate, who had been called plain, who had been offered a single shilling as charity in front of 40 witnesses, and had placed it quietly in her glove, went on being exactly who she had always been, the most important person in the room, whether or not the room had the sense to notice. She had never needed them to notice. She had always known.